everybody. Welcome to this week's episode of the OIG Roundtable. Wade had plastic surgery, and he
Didn't
had his
work.
hair color. It didn't work. He had his hair color changed, and he's about 15 years younger. So we have the OIG Roundtable. We're doing a few things a little bit different here and there. Wade will never not be a member of the OIG Roundtable, but Wade is one of our project managers on a large CMS contract that we have, which takes a lot of his time. So we thought it'd be kind of a little bit of an interesting thing to start bringing to the roundtable some of our internal payment integrity subject matter experts and longtime directors into the fold. And so we wanted to bring Dave Beachler in. Dave Beachler has been with us for a little bit now here at Advise. He's one of our payment integrity directors. And Dave, I wouldn't normally have people introduce themselves because we really don't care. But for people that are wondering, Wade has a fan base. It's really weird. He has a fan club. There's only one member. It's his son. It doesn't really count, but it's still a membership. So, Dave, real quick, who are you? Why the hell are you
Yeah.
here? And I mean, why are you here at Advise? And what are you doing?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me at the roundtable. I'm a roundtable adjacent, right off to the kiddie table, maybe how it might be coming. But I joined Advise just recently. I come bearing about 26 years in the industry. Spent a couple of years within the state Amfuku area working on Medicaid investigations, where I'm from here in Minnesota, and then the last 20 plus years within a couple of the large payer organizations around the country, building out fraud and abuse programs to address not only prepay activities, post-pay activities, but then really focused on how we start getting preventative and start delivering some value back to these organizations beyond the typical prepay savings or dollars in the door.
Yeah, and one of the things that Dave has been doing here is he's been helping with some of the operational stuff as my counterpart and Matt's counterpart. He has been really helping with some of the operational things that as a company, as we grow, that we've had to grow with the contracts. And so Dave has been great in stepping in and kind of dealing with some of the operational stuff and stuff that's out there. But with 20 plus years of experience in payment integrity, you come with a unique side of it that people like Matt and I don't inherently have. And particularly because you have a pretty broad experience in Medicaid commercial and then the Medicare Advantage side with some of the largest payers in the country, it kind of helps to bring kind of that full circle that Advise as a consultancy and advisory company bring to the table. So with that being said, the reason that we brought Dave on is we want to talk about, there's obviously there was the recent national roundup. Matt and I talked about that in the podcast last week, but now OIG just came out with part of its yearly or semi-annual reporting on savings, projected savings, ROI, all of the buzzwords that are out there in the FWA, the fraud, waste, abuse space. Notable was that they're looking at a 12-to-1 ROI, which is a very high ROI. But they're also taking in an estimated, they're calling for an estimate of $5 billion. It's a $5 billion number in recoveries. But when you really start to look at it, it's recoveries, it's anticipated recoveries, it's estimated recoveries. We won't know what that number is until the end of the year. But, Matt, the thing that always strikes is when a provider gets convicted criminally, we'll start with those, and they have a restitution order of $20 million. If the provider doesn't have that, that's $20 million that doesn't exist. Provider goes to prison for a period of time. There's substitute assets. The financial litigation unit gets involved. And so you have to take a little bit of what those numbers are with a grain of salt. In the perfect world, those numbers are the real numbers, but oftentimes those numbers aren't necessarily real. And as a great example, and again, we try not to make these political, but when there are presidential or gubernatorial pardons of convictions in which there's restitution, the conviction goes away, but so do all of the collateral consequences of the orders for restitution. So when you see someone who gets a conviction where there's $1 billion in fraud and they get a pardon from the governor or from the president or whatever it may be, that restitution goes away, that money goes away. And people just need to understand that when the OIG is saying, hey, we anticipate $5 billion in recoveries, that is you have to take it with a grain of salt because there's some other stuff out there. But part of it is, again, it's this whole issue of ROI, and collaterally is how the government tracks that money and how that money goes back into the treasury, how it goes into the Medicare trust fund, all of that. The caveat I'll give is ROI is important in the government space. When I was hired in the mid 90s, I was hired during something known as Operation Restore Trust. For those that don't know, in 1995 or so, the Social Security Administration broke off from HHS, became its own organization with its own administrator. Agents that were working Social Security cases and Social Security fraud cases went to the Social Security Administration, and those that were working primarily a healthcare caseload stayed at HHS OIG. As a result of that, they needed to bolster the numbers because agents, had been depleted because they went to two different agencies. And so one of the things that was done to fix that and create an ability to fund it was something called Operation Restore Trust. Restore Trust meaning the Medicare Trust Fund. And there was money that was pulled from the trust fund that was given to OIG for the purposes of hiring for investigations, audits, enforcement, and things of that sort. I was a benefactor of that. I was hired as part of Operation Restore Trust, where there was an ROI metric of 5 or 6 to 1, depending upon the year. A lot of those metrics still exist. And that's why when OIG talks about 12 to 1, it's because they're talking about a combination of appropriations and then also money that comes out of the trust fund to fund operations. I don't know of any other agency in the federal government, particularly in the law enforcement perspective, that is a return on investment, money making, and I say money making, but a recovering agency. Most other agencies in government are strictly appropriations. HHS OIG is a little bit different. Most of its money does not come from appropriations. So sorry, I went on a tangent, but part of this also has to do with what's known as the HICFAC, the Healthcare Fraud Abuse Control Act, and money that gets returned in what they call sometimes it's known as the 3% funds, right?
Right. Yeah. The HICFAC is the reporting mechanism for any agency that gets funded through the trust fund account. It's the HICFAC fund, and that's us or OIG. It's FBI, DOJ, several other ones that an agency can put in for money each year, getting what they call wedge money. If there's money left over they get some of that, but then they have to report at the end of the year what their ROI is. So, this report's going to consist of how many convictions, how many providers were under investigation, what were the how many civil settlements or civil litigation judgments against the providers, and then they put numbers on that. This conviction, 5 providers found guilty, severally responsible for $5 million in restitution, and that report then goes to DOJ from each of the agencies. DOJ takes that, makes sure there's no duplication. So the FBI's $20 million case is the same as the OIG's $20 million case because it was the same judgment. They take that out and just count it as one. So at the end of the year, they combine all of that and show for the HICFAC agencies, here are the stats. And it'll show, here's how much money went into these agencies for these efforts. Here's how much money was recovered by these agencies. And that's where the difference is. Recoveries have different definitions from each agency. And I think Dave will say for each, plan, for a judgment order or a conviction order for restitution, those are more receivables than recoveries, but they are counted as recoveries.
And it's important to note that, for example, in a criminal case, when a defendant gets sentenced and there's a restitution order, that restitution order is to make the programs whole. You don't get to go and seek money for investigative costs and things of that sort. That's just part of the investigative process. Civil cases, however, when we talk about civil cases and settlements, particularly under the False Claims Act, where you see this damages calculation, 2 or 2.5 or 3 times the damages amount, what happens in those cases is there's actually a pecking order. So, for example, if a provider settles a case for $4 million and that's double damages, and the single damages number, meaning the amount that was defrauded from Medicare, Medicaid, was $2 million, the program gets made whole first, and then the OIG gets to recover its investigative costs. And so the OIG is made whole for the time and effort to investigate you. And then any money left over goes into the general treasury fund. So there's this pecking order that comes out. Now, if due to whatever the issue is, the amount that's recovered is not double damages, let's say there's an inability to pay, it's only single damages, the goal is always to make the program whole. And get the money back into the program. The cost of the investigation is just a collateral consequence. And so, Dave, that brings us to your part, because from the plan side, the plan has an ROI and that differs, but it's kind of in a similar vein, that the goal of getting an overpayment back from a provider that settles with the plan is to make the plan whole on those costs. It's not really about separately funding the SIU or the payment integrity team.
Correct. And we have on the payer side, it's balancing between the different lines of business that we may have. Obviously, first and foremost, with anything in our Medicaid, Medicare lines of business, compliance is your first and foremost concern. How do we identify these, investigate these, and get them reported to the appropriate agencies so that they can take these actions that you're talking about? There is the self-insured, fully insured private plans, though, too, where, on the private side, we have that ability to go out. They can litigate cases. They can seek civil damages against these providers. You want to get that money in to made whole again. Because within the payer space, too, once those dollars are out the door, we're challenged at every level with everyone else. You're never going to get a one-for-one return on these things. You're only getting sometimes 40, 50 cents on the dollar back in the door. And within the payer space too, it's where we can have some real impact. When we think about 10% of all healthcare dollars being paid out nationally could be fraudulent. If we can impact that by bringing in more of those dollars or preventing those dollars from going out the door in the first place, it can have a real impact on the overall cost of healthcare nationally within the commercial space and bleed over into those government areas as well. And that's where, from my experience and from the things that I've worked on, while I've gone through the progressions of doing prepay investigations, being a post-pay investigator, negotiating settlements, to then really looking at it and say, okay, to be successful within the payer space, our objective is how can we stop those dollars from ever going out the door, knowing that either, number one, if they're already out the door and they're in our commercial world, we're only going to see pennies back on the dollar. Number two, if they're impacted by our government business, we then get into that string of going through the process of making those critical regulatory referrals, but now it's going to get into that system where the government needs to go through their process of obtaining those funds back, making themselves whole again as well.
Right. And, the thing I think that becomes not so much the challenge, but, understanding that from the OIG perspective, oftentimes an OIG agent is only dealing with the Medicare, Medicaid issues.
Yep.
And then sometimes an OIG agent who isn't necessarily thinking outside the box will just go to the FBI and say, hey, I've got this case and this other insurance plan is involved. One thing that always people need to understand is that as long as the OIG agent has a nexus into that government plan, you have the ability to investigate anything within that healthcare fraud that's out there. You don't need that separate agency that's out there. But what winds up happening is that oftentimes the commercial payers get left out in the dust on a civil case. Unfortunately, on a civil case, they're always left out in the dust, the commercial payers. On a criminal case, they may be left in the dust. It just depends. But I can tell you that what I've seen on the payer side, particularly on the Medicare Advantage side, is I'm starting to see commercial payers with a Medicare Advantage line of business separately getting into litigation with the defendant of a false claims case, meaning that the government settled a False Claims Act case with a provider, and the one payer that was excluded, or the payers that could be excluded, could be Medicare Advantage lines of business, but they weren't included in the Civil False Claims Act case for whatever reason. And so those those Medicare Advantage payers are then separately litigating at the state level or maybe even the federal level with that provider that was part of that initial case. But talk a little bit about and I don't want to belabor it too much, but obviously, ROI, the problem with ROI is that everybody has their own way to calculate ROI. There is no industry standard. We've seen some things out there where, there's kind of a generalist feeling about what it is, but ROI is really based upon what the plan has determined to be the right way to calculate it, and whether it's defensible through accounting measures or compliance or legal. But there isn't unfortunately a blanket methodology for ROI, and that ROI is going to could be widely variant depending upon how the payer wants to calculate it.
No rhyme or reason. Yeah, you really have to work internally with your own internal financial actuarial groups to bring these things together. A real quick kind of story on this too is, one of the areas of return on investment that we determined during a program that I worked with was a flat rate for every certain provider type that we had found, and we were able to stop. And at the time, the way we determined that was based upon the historical loss that we had for that provider type. So for the sake of this example, it was about $600 per provider type. We went back 4 years later and we did a reassessment of this because we were so successful with the program. And based upon the logic we used, we determined that the loss to that provider type had dropped by about 98%. So we're looking at that from a program integrity perspective. We're looking at say that's huge success. Our actuarials and our finance areas like, well, now instead of us giving you $600, we're only going to give you, I think it was like about $180. That has a huge impact when you're looking at bottom line ROI, because you're looking at a program where it's like, I'm funding a team, I'm funding professionals to do something, and they are showing this 4-to-1, 5-to-1 return. But now, because we don't do a very good job of bragging about our successes within this space, all the top line shows is you go from 600 down to 180, and it comes with this aspect of the better we do, sometimes the worse we look from an ROI perspective. But our real objective is, how do we tell that story better to show the value outside of just those hard dollars? How do we project out what those losses could have been had we not put in these preventative actions? So that's one method that has been used. Others are going to look at it and they simply will take a straight line look at billed charges. That's not going to be your best route too, because it doesn't take into account a lot of factors that would come down with that claim if it would have paid or would have paid at a different rate. So then we switch over to, do we have to generate a broad calculation on what is paid versus billed to help us generate that out? And how do you project it? If I can stop a provider today, how do we know that provider would have continued to bill us for the next 6 months or 12 months? We don't know that. And so it really becomes a huge partnership to develop what those ROI calculations are going to be that your business is willing to accept, and that's going to be digestible for the book to accept too, if it goes beyond just that, the old school mentality, not old school mentality, but those hard factor numbers of saying, well, we sent out $1 million worth of overpayment letters, we got in $500,000. That's tangible. People can see it and understand it. Now it becomes, we stopped X behavior from occurring, and we anticipated that would have generated about $1 million in paid dollars going out the door.
And I'll tell you, not that we're going to talk about war stories, but I know that the old school OIG thing for a long time was that when you completed a case, and Matt, you'll remember this, it wasn't just tracking restitution or the damages calculation, but there was also where somebody was asking for projected savings.
Yep.
But the kicker, Dave, was that you would be asked to provide projected savings. There was no time period that was being asked, and there was no benchmark for how you did it. So typically what we did in New York was we would say, okay, I worked on this case, and let's say I identified $1 million in fraud for a 3-year period. $1 million total 3-year. My projected savings was always going to be, $1 million 3 years. Because I would say, well, if we didn't stop the provider, I have no information to suggest that the provider's behavior was going to change for the better. I had no
Right.
information to suggest that their behavior was going to change for the worse. You just had no way of doing it. There was no way to calculate it. And I think the difference is that today, where we could see projected savings is in the prepay space. That's tangible, right? You have the actual tangibility of saying, okay, this provider submitted claims for $1,000. We denied $500 projected savings, or savings is really tangible, 500. So there's a little bit of a differentiator from kind of predictively estimating what your projected savings is to real-time savings projections.
And I in the aspect of that, sorry, man, the aspect of that too, I like to be able to track it is
the insurance mope interrupting the OIG and the
I
OIG
know,
roundtable.
I tell you, I'm taking this thing over. You get a distinction though. I mean, being in the payer space, all the years that I've spent in there, our overall objectives, man, we wanted to see somebody get arrested, we wanted to see him prosecuted, but that's not really what we did. And where we really struggled was, how do we define that line between the things that really should go to the OIG, be investigated, be prosecuted, which was never our determination to make, versus those things that were truly that waste and abuse area. In the prepay space, you can see those changes and you can then ask the question, is this a change in behavior for the better? And do I have a guy who's just sloppy versus now I'm watching something, I'm not seeing something change. Does it give me more indications of a potential intentional ability to defraud where now I need to get those to my partners within the government?
And we've talked about this on many podcasts, and we could talk about this forever about prepay. Prepay is going to have one of two goals. One goal is going to either be behavior modification. My old mentor, Jason Eisenrein, used to never say he was a special agent. He would always say, I'm an antisocial behavior modification specialist. But in the prepay space, you're going to have, one of the results of prepay are either change of behavior or continued behavior and a referral to the SIU or whatever it is, because behavior change is going to either be the provider's just going to stop billing for that code, whether that's right or wrong, right? Just that's one way that a provider is going to deal with prepay. If they're on prepay for a particular code, they're either going to stop billing for it, or they're going to take the prepay education and training and heed those recommended changes to change their behavior on how to document to get paid for those claims. And I'm not, again, good, bad, or indifferent. Prepay is to force behavior modification for someone who wishes to change their behavior. A provider who's submitting the claims and listening to the auditor's recommendations is not the same as someone who pumps and dumps, right, and goes through, right? There's a difference between it. And so ROI, I think, and Matt, I'll give you the last word as we wrap up, because we deal with ROI questions and conversations every day, and I'm not even exaggerating, and I'm not using the word literally every day, but we deal with ROI related discussions with our clients on a regular basis, because we've got to deal with ROI in two ways. And the ROI is, we issued overpayment letters. What was the ultimate number that we got? Because that's going to help with determining what the thresholds are. Are we taking 50 cents on the dollar, 75 cents on the dollar? What's right? Because there's provider abrasion, there's network issues, there's all of that stuff. But then the other piece of it is the discussion that we always have with our clients is, what's my ROI? What's my ROI? And that becomes the challenge, because the ROI can be an intangible number. We talk about ROI from an intangibility perspective, right, Matt? Because when you've got investigators, for example, that are well trained, they're more efficient, they can handle more cases. ROI may be higher because they're working a larger volume of cases. So I give you the last word, because ROI is the thing that you deal with
every day. I still have to go look up intangibility, but I'm not sure that's a word, but I'm going to find out. But ROI, I mean, you've brought up the complexities of it, but think about it. You've got the hard dollars coming in, the actual recoveries. You've got the actual receivables from things like overpayment letters or criminal restitution orders. Then you got savings, prepay savings, a little easier to calculate. But then what about, someone gets revoked or someone gets excluded from Medicare and Medicaid for an indeterminate amount of time because they lost their license? What's the savings there? Like you said, there's no time frames. How do you calculate that? How do you calculate funds put to better use. Again, it's this provider stopped billing and he was billing badly, but someone else is picking up
Right.
those patients and billing for them. Are they doing
Right.
it better? You just don't know.
Right.
These things are impossible to give a concrete number to. And then we get it from clients with, well, you're going to do some training. What's the ROI on the training? And you
Right.
alluded to that a little bit, but that's
We get that all
impossible to
the time. We
calculate.
get that all the time because one of the so first and foremost, thanks to the speed of the internet, I'm pleased to share that intangibility is a valid English word. We'll leave it at that. I
Oh,
know
that
that
was
here that
quick. That was
I know
really
that.
quick.
Listen, I don't. If you're going to challenge me, don't bring a knife to a gunfight, my friend. You're not even my light work. I know as as like the guru of writing here. Sometimes it is what it is. But you're right. And to wrap this up, the thing that comes up the most often is when we're putting together a training session and we're negotiating the frequency, whatever it is. We get asked all the time, how do I calculate the return on my investment of having Eric and Matt and Dave come and do an on-site for 3 days, or come out and do a virtual session, or something along those lines. And it's very difficult to ascertain, because if you have a room of 15 people, you have 15 people who are going to have vastly different ways of learning. Some are going to be the didactic people where you can sit and lecture them and they catch it. Other people are hands-on. I mean, we talk a lot about, when you're putting together a case, the importance from an investigator's perspective of having visuals, right? Investigators are visual people kind of by nature, but we do often run into this when we're putting together a training. It's, how do I measure the return on my investment for this training? And there are a number of ways that you can sort of check to see if the training stuck, right? You do the training and then 6 months later, you can do a repeat. I worked in EMS for many years. I was a CPR instructor, and I would say, okay, we would do the training, and then 6 months later, we would do a retest. And you would see, how well did people remember how to do CPR? It's a very tangible thing that you can do. But from general training, people sitting in a room for a day, an hour, a week, it doesn't matter. The question really becomes, how do you measure that training as an ROI tool? Because I need to know, is my budget for training going to remain, increase, or decrease in future years? And I think that's just one of the difficult things, is being able to ascertain that. From a practical perspective, look, you can go out, you could teach someone a skill on how to shoot a handgun and firearms training, and you give them that training, and then 6 months later, you can go and retest them. But what you don't know is, in these 6 months during that period of time, were they going to the range every week? Were they practicing?
Right.
When we show somebody a skill in Excel, when we show someone how to do something as simple as random sampling, not statistical sampling, random sampling using the RAND function, in 6 months, if we retested someone on that and they didn't have a recollection of how to do it, did they practice it over that ensuing 6 months or not? We just, you have to, there's so many other factors in training that are elusive to the people on the training side, and may just be elusive to the people receiving the training. So it doesn't mean that you shouldn't go through. All training is good training, even when it's bad, because even bad training will teach you what not to do, right? But I think that the challenge is always going to be, in some areas in our space, the intangible part of ROI is going. That's probably the number one thing that we get asked about, is how to do that. Some of these other things are tangible. When you get money in the door, that's a tangible. You can measure that. When you save money through prepay, you can ascertain that number. When you have an edit in place and a provider is submitting a claim that's part of an NCCI or an MUE or a plan edit, there's a level of tangibility that's there. So I think it's always the challenge. But looking back again, kind of the whole point of this is, when we look at the OIGs, the whole point of this podcast for today was, when you look at the OIG having a 12-to-1 ROI, it kind of, you want to look a little under the hood and say, is that a real number? Is it a projected number? How did you ultimately get to that 12-to-1? A little bit of is going to, just peeling back that onion. So we always look at these things, and it's interesting because we deal with them on a day-to-day basis. I know a lot of the people that that tune into our podcast are facing the same kind of questions, because a lot of it ultimately comes down to justification. If you've got a staff of one person versus a staff of 15, that ROI is going to be a piece of the puzzle. The last thing I'll close with is that, a small plan that has one or two investigators that does a $50,000 case, that could be the functional equivalent of one of the larger payers doing a $5 or a $10 million case. So you have the dollars themselves aren't nearly as impressive or as important as how it kind of equates to the size of the plan, the dollars in the door, the dollars out the door. When a large plan recovers $50,000, that's not even a blip on their radar. But when a small regional plan collects $50,000, that's tangible money that could have an effect on how that plan operates, kind of in a go forward. Kind of gets back to what you said, Dave.
Yeah, know your business, know what's expected. I can even just say from history, we've worked with plans that, we've been able to come in actually with advise to be very specific and show achievements that to that plan meant so much more than to the larger group that plan was a part of. And so, it's important to understand what you want to achieve through your program, what means success. All those things are going to tie into it, to how you measure your ROI.
Yeah, it's a great closing point, even though I said Matt can have the closing
I know,
word.
it was
but,
like 5 minutes ago.
Yeah, the interloper apparently has decided that he wants to take charge. But it's very simple how we fix the interloper. We just click remove from meeting. It's very easy.
Listen,
So.
I never get to play at the big boys table. This is fun. I got to take advantage of it.
Nice. Welcome. You turned 14. You're now a man. You get to sit on Thanksgiving and carve the turkey. So, listen, Dave, it was great having you. I know we're not gonna have you here on a regular basis because this is the OIG Roundtable. It's not the OIG plus interloper roundtable, but it's okay to have you here into the fold. Wade, we do miss you. We look forward to having you back. But to everybody that tunes in every week, and we get this question asked, the ROI question is one that pops up pretty frequently. We do enjoy interacting with you on all of those. And again, every Friday you can get this podcast in the newsletter. Just go up onto our website, sign up for it. Again, you can catch us on Spotify, on YouTube, as well as our monthly LinkedIn Lives. And for those of you that do join our monthly LinkedIn Lives, you'll be seeing a lot more Dave. We're going to be doing a lot of payment integrity related, data related, all of those things that are in some of our newer team members' wheelhouses. And so you'll be seeing Dave on a lot more of the LinkedIn Lives. And we'll have you back. Matt and I will have a discussion. Right now, we have a secret ballot about whether or not we're going to have you continue.
You got the white balls and the black balls, and you put them in the little basket.
Yeah.
But Dave and I, we're going to be doing one talking about cooking. We're doing something on fish soup.
Yep.
So that'll be a good LinkedIn Live.
Stay, because fish soup isn't always about making the broth, right? It's always it's about other things. So tune in for that one. I know that's coming up in the next couple of weeks. But in the meantime, we enjoy spending our time with everybody, and we'll see you on the next OIG Roundtable plus Interloper. Have a good one.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.